She was just fleeing west through the Arizona Territory's scorching desert, running from a railroad scandal that had destroyed her father's bank and her family's name, until a 12-year-old Navajo boy with silver-stained fingers asked, "Wanna meet my papa?" What she discovered at that remote trading post would expose a conspiracy reaching from the Union Pacific boardrooms to the War Department in Washington, cost her everything she thought mattered, and give her the only family she'd ever truly known. The August sun beat down on the dusty trail to Flagstaff like the wrath of an angry god, turning Amanda Brooks' black traveling dress into a furnace that threatened to cook her alive before she reached civilization. Her hired wagon, once elegant enough for Boston society, now groaned under the punishment of desert travel while its springs protested every rock and rut with metallic shrieks that echoed across the wasteland.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Amanda gripped the leather reins with hands that still trembled, not from the desert heat, but from the memory of federal marshals ransacking her father's Boston banking house 3 weeks ago. Former daughter of Charles Brooks, president of the New England Trust and Railway Investment Company, she'd lived a life of Eastern privilege until the morning when investigators discovered her signature on railroad land grant documents that had defrauded 3 Indian tribes out of territory worth millions in gold and silver she hadn't known. That was the hell of it. Every contract she'd witnessed, every legal document she'd notarized as her father's representative, every business agreement she'd helped negotiate had been carefully crafted to hide the truth from her. But ignorance wasn't a defense when your signature appeared on federal fraud charges, and the Boston newspapers didn't care about technicalities when they had a story about a banker's daughter stealing from Indian tribes. The trail stretched endlessly through Monument Valley's towering red spires, landmarks she recognized from railroad survey photographs, but had never imagined experiencing in person. The landscape was beautiful and terrifying in its indifference, a place where human problems seemed insignificant against the weight of geological time. Her problems, however, felt enormous enough to crush her beneath their weight. Her small leather purse contained exactly $47 in gold coins, a train ticket to San Francisco that might be worthless if federal marshals had telegraphed ahead, and a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who might or might not remember her family fondly enough to provide sanctuary. At 28, Amanda Brooks had gone from Boston society hostess to fugitive in less than a month. The warning rattle of her wagon's loose wheel joined a symphony of mechanical complaints she'd been ignoring since Albuquerque. The hired conveyance had been designed for city streets and country roads, not for the punishing reality of territorial travel. Like its passenger, the wagon was discovering that Eastern elegance meant nothing when stripped of the environment that supported it. She pulled over at a rocky outcropping, ostensibly to check her crude territorial map, but really to postpone the moment when she'd have to accept that she was lost in more ways than one. The hand-drawn chart showed her position as a thin line threading between vast expanses marked simply as Navajo territory. No detail, no landmarks, no indication of settlements or water sources. A dust devil spun across the trail, a miniature tornado of red earth that danced for 30 seconds before dissolving into the heat shimmer. Amanda watched it with fascination and envy. To be something so elemental, so purposeful in its destruction, then to simply cease to exist when the forces that created it shifted. There was a freedom in that kind of impermanence. Her water barrel was nearly empty, and the realization brought the first real spike of fear she'd felt since this nightmare began. Financial ruin was abstract, social disgrace was manageable, but thirst in the desert was physical and immediate. She'd been so focused on escaping that she hadn't properly planned for the journey, assuming that money and connections would solve any problems she encountered. But gold was worthless when there was no one to pay. The map showed a small settlement called Whispering Winds about 20 miles ahead, marked with a tiny symbol that might indicate a trading post. 20 miles with a loose wagon wheel, in heat that was already making her horses strain against their traces. Amanda calculated odds with the same analytical mind that had once helped her father evaluate railroad investments. The mathematics were not encouraging. She folded the map with hands that shook slightly and climbed back onto the wagon seat. The leather had absorbed so much heat that it felt like a brand against her skin, even through her heavy traveling. Dress, another reminder that everything about her current situation was wrong. She was a creature of parlors and tea parties, not someone who belonged in places where nature actively tried to kill you. 15 miles later, the wagon gave up with a grinding shriek of metal and the acrid smell of overheated axle grease. Amanda coasted to a stop beside the trail, watching the left rear wheel wobble drunkenly before finally separating completely from its axle. The silence after the mechanical groaning died was absolute and terrifying, broken only by the nervous whickering of her horses and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. She sat on the driver's bench for 10 minutes, watching heat waves rise from the desert floor like spirits fleeing purgatory. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her adult life helping her father evaluate failing railroad companies, analyzing the precise moment when denial gave way to acceptance of bankruptcy. Now she was experiencing that moment personally, in the most literal way possible. The heat outside the wagon's meager shade was like opening a blast furnace door. Amanda had never experienced anything like it. A physical presence that seemed to press against every exposed inch of skin. Her traveling clothes, tailored wool jacket, silk blouse, buttoned boots, transformed from armor into liability within minutes. She was a walking advertisement for someone who didn't belong here. She examined the broken wheel with growing despair, her limited mechanical knowledge sufficient only to confirm that this wasn't something she could repair with hairpins. And determination. The metal axle had snapped clean through, while the wooden wheel lay in pieces scattered across the desert like the remnants of her former life. Her supplies consisted of half a barrel of water that tasted like wood and metal, a basket of hard crackers and dried beef that her Boston housekeeper had packed, and a small Derringer pistol that her father had insisted she carry. The weapon felt ridiculously inadequate against the vast indifference of the desert, like bringing a hatpin to a cavalry charge. The trail stretched empty in both directions, a ribbon of dusty earth that seemed to connect nowhere to nowhere. No other travelers, no signs of human activity, just the vast emptiness of a landscape that had been killing unprepared Eastern travelers for decades. Amanda had read newspaper accounts of pioneers who died within sight of water sources, of experienced frontiersmen who perished because they underestimated the desert's power to kill. She began walking back the way she'd come, carrying a canvas water bag like a talisman. The rocky ground radiated heat through the solace of her boots, and within 20 minutes she understood that this was a mathematics problem with a rapidly approaching deadline. Her body was losing water faster than she could replace it, and the nearest confirmed civilization was still too far away to reach on foot. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn with desperate hope, but the riders who emerged from the heat shimmer weren't what she expected. A small boy on a paint pony, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies that suggested familiarity with desert travel. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, but he rode with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. The boy reined in his pony 50 feet ahead of her, studying Amanda with dark eyes that seemed far older than his years. He was Navajo, she realized, with black hair that fell to his shoulders and clothing that mixed traditional and territorial styles. But what caught her attention were his hand-stained silver gray with what looked like metal dust or paint. "Your wagon's broke," the boy said. Not a question but a simple statement of observed fact. His English carried the musical accent she'd heard from other Indians in the territories, but his grammar was precise in a way that suggested formal education. "Yes," Amanda managed, suddenly aware of how she must look. "Sweat-stained Eastern."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Clothes, face flushed with heat exhaustion, the general appearance of someone who'd made catastrophically poor choices. Do you know if there's help nearby? The boy rode past her to examine the broken wagon, dismounting with fluid grace to poke at the shattered wheel and snapped axle. He made a sound that managed to convey both sympathy and inevitability, the universal expression of someone who'd seen this particular disaster before. "This one's finished," he announced, wiping his hands on a leather rag he pulled from his saddlebags. "Axles snapped clean through. Happens to eastern wagons out here all the time. They're not built for territorial roads." Amanda felt something cold settle in her stomach despite the blazing heat. "Finished? As in you'll need a new wagon, and that'll cost more than most folks carry in traveling money." The boy studied her with those unsettlingly mature eyes. "Where were you heading?" "San Francisco," Amanda said, which was both true and completely inadequate to explain her situation. How do you tell a 12-year-old that you're fleeing federal fraud charges, while simultaneously having no actual plan beyond putting distance? Between yourself and disaster, the boy nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's a long way from here." "You got supplies for that kind of journey." "I thought I did," Amanda admitted, surprised by her honesty. Something about the boy's direct gaze made evasion seem pointless. "But I didn't plan on breaking down in the middle of nowhere." "This isn't nowhere," the boy observed with casual wisdom that reminded Amanda of her grandfather's favorite sayings. "This is Navajo territory. Plenty of somewhere if you know how to look for it. The question is whether you're running to something or away from something." He was right, of course. Amanda had been fleeing for 3 weeks without any plan beyond escaping the reach of federal marshals and newspaper reporters. But running toward nothing was just another form of standing still. "What's your name?" she asked, partly to change the subject and partly because she realized this child might be her only hope for survival. "Lucas Silversmith," the boy replied, dismounting completely and extending one of his silver-stained hands in a formal handshake. That seemed incongruous with his age. "This is my family's territory, and you're about 10 miles from the nearest place that can help with your situation." Amanda shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip and the calluses that spoke of physical work far beyond what any 12-year-old should know. "I'm Amanda Brooks, and I'd appreciate any help you can offer." Lucas studied her for a long moment, taking in her expensive clothes and obvious unfamiliarity with frontier life. "You don't look like the kind of person who usually ends up broken down in Indian territory." "I'm not," Amanda said simply. "I'm not the kind of person who usually ends up anywhere like this. But here you are," Lucas pointed out with the logical directness of youth. "Which means maybe you're a different kind of person than you thought you were." Before Amanda could process that observation, Lucas made a decision that would change both their lives. He gestured toward his pack mule with casual hospitality, as if inviting stranded strangers to his family's home was the most natural thing in the world. "Want to meet my papa?" he asked, beginning to untie supplies from his mule's pack saddle. "He runs the trading post up at Whispering Winds. He'll know what to do about your wagon. And we've got cool water and shade to sit in while we figure things out." Amanda looked at the empty trail, at her broken wagon baking in the sun, at this remarkable boy who seemed completely unimpressed by her predicament. The sensible thing would be to wait for other travelers, to try to flag down someone more conventional, to maintain some semblance of control over her situation. But the desert was patient and implacable. And Lucas Silversmith had silver-stained hands and eyes that seemed to see straight through to the truth of things. Sometimes the sensible choice and the right choice were different animals entirely. "Yes," Amanda heard herself saying. "I'd like to meet your papa," Lucas grinned, the first completely unself-conscious expression she'd seen from him. "Good. He likes meeting people who are traveling through Says everyone's got a story about where they've been and where they're going. And the interesting part is usually what happens between those two places. As Lucas helped her transfer her belongings to his pack mule, Amanda couldn't know that she was about to discover exactly what his father meant. The boy moved with the efficient competence of someone who'd been handling emergencies since he could walk, securing her bags and water barrel with knots that would hold through any kind of weather. "Can you ride?" Lucas asked, looking at her. Long skirts and button boots with practical concern. "I used to," Amanda replied, though her experience consisted mainly of sedate rides through Boston Common rather than cross-country desert travel. "It's been a while, we'll take it easy," Lucas assured her, helping her mount the pack mule with the patient courtesy of someone accustomed to helping greenhorns survive their first encounter with the real West. "Daisy here is gentle as a lamb, and Papa always says that getting somewhere safe is more important than getting somewhere fast." As they rode away from her broken wagon and the last remnants of her eastern life, Amanda found herself studying the boy's profile. He navigated the desert trails with an intimacy that spoke of lifelong familiarity, pointing out landmarks and water sources that were invisible to her untrained eye. "How old are you?" she asked, suddenly concerned about following a child through territory that seemed designed to kill unwary travelers. 12, Lucas confirmed, apparently unconcerned by the implications. "But I've been riding these trails since I was old enough to sit a saddle. Out here, you learn what you need to learn when you need to learn it. Papa says the desert teaches patience to those who listen and buries those who don't." The landscape around them was breathtaking and alien. Red rock formations sculpted by millions of years of wind and water into shapes that seemed both natural and impossible. Amanda had never experienced silence like this, so profound that she could hear her own heartbeat and the soft whisper of her mule's hooves against stone. It was beautiful and terrifying, and completely unlike anything in her previous experience. "What's that staining on your hands?" she asked, noticing how the silver color seemed to shift and shimmer in the desert light. Lucas held up his hands, examining the stains as if seeing them for the first time. "Silver dust. I help my papa with jewelry making. Traditional Navajo silversmithing. The metal has to be hammered and filed, and the dust gets into everything, no matter how careful you are. You make jewelry. Papa does the real work. I just help with the grinding and polishing and learning the techniques. But someday, I'll know the whole process. It's been in our family for as long as anyone can remember, passed down from grandfather to father to son." As they rode deeper into Navajo territory, Amanda began to understand that she was entering a world governed by different rules, different values, different understandings of what mattered. Lucas spoke of his family's traditions with casual pride, of knowledge passed down through generations, of skills that connected him to ancestors he'd never met, but whose presence seemed tangible in this landscape. The trading post appeared, gradually, first as a speck of human habitation against the red rocks, then as a collection of buildings that seemed to grow organically from the desert floor. Smoke rose from stone chimneys, and the sound of metal on metal suggested active blacksmithing work. It looked nothing like any business Amanda had ever seen, more like a small settlement that happened to welcome travelers. "That's Papa," Lucas said, pointing toward a figure emerging from the main building as they approached a collection of corrals and outbuildings that spoke of serious commerce despite the remote location. Daniel Silversmith was a man who seemed carved from the same red stone as the landscape around him, weathered and enduring and completely at home in an environment that had nearly killed Amanda within hours of her arrival. He wore traditional Navajo clothing, mixed with practical frontier attire, silver jewelry that caught the light, and an expression of patient curiosity as he watched his son return with an unexpected passenger. As Amanda dismounted from the mule, she felt the weight of Daniel Silversmith's assessment, not hostile but thorough, the kind of evaluation that seemed to catalog not just what you looked like, but who you were underneath the surface presentation. She had the distinct feeling that very little escaped this man's attention. "Papa," Lucas called, leading the pack mule toward the corral with the easy familiarity of someone returning home after routine errands. "Found someone who needs help." Her eastern wagon broke down on the Flagstaff Trail. Daniel Silversmith's eyes moved from his son to Amanda, taking in her expensive clothes, her obvious displacement, the way she held herself like someone trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that made dignity irrelevant. When he smiled, it transformed his entire face, revealing a warmth that made Amanda understand why Lucas had been so confident in bringing her here. "Welcome to Whispering Winds," Daniel said, his voice carrying the same musical quality as his son's but deeper, aged like good whiskey in desert heat. "Any friend of Lucas is welcome here. Let's get you out of this sun and see what we can do to help." As Amanda followed father and son toward the trading post, she caught sight of her reflection in the window of a wagon and barely recognized herself. 3 weeks ago she'd been Amanda Brooks, Boston society lady, master of Eastern social graces, feared and respected in the parlors and counting houses of New England. Now she was a broken-down stranger in the desert, dependent on the kindness of a 12-year-old boy and his father. But as she stepped into the cool interior of the trading post and felt the immediate relief of shade and the promise of cool water, Amanda realized something that surprised her. For the first time in 3 weeks, possibly for the first time in years, she felt safe. The interior of Whispering Winds Trading Post was like stepping into a world where East met West in ways that Eastern newspapers never described. Hand-woven Navajo rugs covered rough-hewn wooden floors, their geometric patterns telling stories Amanda couldn't read, but somehow felt in her bones. Shelves lined with silver jewelry caught the filtered sunlight streaming through windows, while pottery painted with ancient designs shared space with modern tools and supplies that connected this remote outpost to the wider territorial economy. Daniel Silversmith moved through this space with the quiet confidence of a man who'd built something meaningful from nothing, gesturing for Amanda to take a seat at a rough wooden table near a window that framed Monument Valley's impossible spires. He disappeared through a doorway covered by hanging beads, returning moments later with a clay pitcher filled with water so cold it made her teeth ache and pure enough to taste like it had been filtered through centuries of sandstone. "Drink slowly," he advised, settling into the chair across from her with the patient manner of someone who'd hosted countless travelers in various states of distress. Desert has its own lessons about patience, and the first one is that rushing water into a heat-sick body can do more harm than good. Amanda forced herself to sip rather than gulp, though every cell in her dehydrated body screamed for more. As she drank, she became aware of Daniel studying her with the same thorough assessment she'd felt outside. But now she could see something else behind his dark eyes, an intelligence that reminded her of the sharpest railroad investors her father had ever dealt with, combined with a wisdom that came from sources her Eastern education had never acknowledged. "Lucas says your wagon threw an axle," Daniel observed, his tone conversational but probing in the way of a man accustomed to evaluating strangers who appeared in his territory under suspicious circumstances. "That's expensive to fix out here, assuming you can find replacement parts for Eastern-built equipment. Might be simpler to sell what's salvageable and catch the next freight wagon to Flagstaff. I'm not entirely sure where I'm going," Amanda admitted, the honesty surprising her again. Something about this place made deception feel not just pointless, but disrespectful, as if the very walls could sense falsehood and found it wanting. "I was trying to put distance between myself and some trouble back east," Daniel nodded as if this explanation was both complete and completely insufficient, the response of someone who'd heard similar stories from dozens of travelers, fleeing various forms of Eastern complications. Trouble has a way of following people who run without looking back. Sometimes the only way through difficulty is straight ahead, not around the edges. Before Amanda could ask what he meant by that observation, Lucas burst through the front door with the barely contained energy of a 12-year-old who had important news to share. His silver-stained hands carried what appeared to be a telegraph message, yellow paper that still crackled with the importance of long-distance communication. "Papa, you need to read this," Lucas announced, setting the telegraph on their table. With the careful precision of someone who understood the significance of written words in a largely illiterate frontier society. Mr. Henderson at the telegraph office said it came from Boston this morning, asking about Amanda Brooks. Amanda's stomach dropped like a stone falling into a mine shaft. She'd been hoping for anonymity, for the luxury of being nobody in the middle of nowhere. But even in this remote corner of Arizona territory, the telegraph lines had reached long enough to find her. The yellow paper contained a message that made Amanda want to disappear into the desert floor. Reward $500 information whereabouts Amanda Brooks stop wanted federal fraud charges railroad. Land grant stop contact U.S. Marshal Denver stop Brooks. Family disowned suspect stop. Daniel Silversmith's expression didn't change as he read the message, but something shifted in the air between them, a tension that hadn't existed moments before. Lucas looked from his father to Amanda with the confused expression of someone who'd accidentally stepped into adult complications he didn't fully understand. "Is this about you?" Daniel asked quietly, his voice carrying no accusation but demanding honesty in return. The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, impossible to ignore and dangerous to answer. Amanda stared at the telegraph message, at her own name reduced to a few lines of official text that made her sound like a common criminal. Fleeing justice. The woman described in that message felt like a stranger, someone who'd made choices that led inevitably to disgrace and exile. "The charges are real," Amanda said carefully, choosing her words like a lawyer constructing a defense against hanging. "My signature is on railroad land grant documents that defrauded Indian tribes out of territory worth millions in gold and silver, but I didn't know what I was signing. The contracts were structured to hide their real purpose from anyone who wasn't part of the inner circle, but you signed them anyway," Lucas pointed out with the brutal logic of youth, his voice carrying no judgment, but requiring acknowledgement of basic facts. "Yes, I signed them." Amanda looked directly at Daniel, forcing herself not to look away from whatever judgment she might see there. "I trusted people I shouldn't have trusted, and I put my name on documents I should have read more carefully. Legal innocence and moral responsibility aren't the same thing in this situation." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Amanda to hear the distant sound of metal on metal from Daniel's forge and the soft whisper of wind through the trading post's wooden walls. She waited for him to ask her to leave, to tell her that Navajo hospitality didn't extend to people who'd stolen from Indian tribes, even accidentally. Instead, Daniel set the telegraph message aside and leaned back in his chair, studying Amanda with renewed interest rather than disapproval. His reaction suggested someone who'd learned to distinguish between enemies and victims, between deliberate criminals and people caught in circumstances beyond their understanding. "Which tribes?" he asked, the question carrying weight that Amanda was only beginning to understand. "The Northern Cheyenne in Montana Territory, the Lakota Nation in Dakota Territory, and the Hopi here in Arizona Territory." The contracts transferred mineral exploration rights to shell companies controlled by the Union Pacific Railroad. "I negotiated the agreements thinking they were legitimate business partnerships that would benefit everyone involved." Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of emotion he'd shown since reading the telegraph message. "The Hopi are our neighbors and allies. Good people whose land has been under attack by railroad companies and territorial governments since the first surveys were drawn. If someone found a new way to steal from them, that affects all the tribes in this region eventually." Lucas looked between the adults with growing understanding, his young mind beginning to grasp the connections between Amanda's personal crisis and larger patterns of injustice that affected his own people. So Amanda got tricked into helping bad people steal from tribes. But she didn't know she was doing it. That's a simplified version, but essentially correct, Amanda confirmed. Grateful for the boy's ability to cut through legal complexity to reach basic moral truth. The federal prosecutors and Boston newspapers believe I was the mastermind behind the fraud, but I was actually just a useful fool with the right family connections and social credentials. And now you're running, Daniel observed, not a question but a statement that invited explanation without demanding confession. Now I'm running from federal charges I can't defend against and newspaper coverage that's already decided I'm guilty. My family has disowned me. My social connections have evaporated. And my father's lawyers say the best I can hope for is a plea bargain that puts me in territorial prison for 10 to 15 years. Amanda realized she was crying tears she'd been holding back for 3 weeks, finally escaping despite her efforts at maintaining Eastern dignity. The stress, the dehydration, the sheer overwhelming nature of losing everything she'd built, combined with the unexpected kindness of strangers, had finally broken through her defenses. Daniel handed her a bandana from his pocket, soft cotton that smelled like sage smoke and honest labor. Prison is what happens to people who don't fight back, he said quietly, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd watched too many innocent people accept punishment they didn't deserve. Maybe the question isn't whether you're guilty of what they're accusing you of. Maybe the question is what you're going to do about the people who actually are guilty. I don't have any proof that would stand up in territorial court, Amanda protested, her legal training asserting itself despite the surreal circumstances of discussing criminal defense strategy in an Indian trading post. Everything I know is circumstantial evidence that could be interpreted multiple ways. Corporate meetings where decisions were made in coded language, document structures that hide their true purpose, financial arrangements that obscure actual ownership. Nothing a territorial prosecutor could use to build a case. Courts aren't the only place where justice happens, Daniel replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, the expression of someone who'd learned that legal systems weren't always designed to protect the innocent. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in places where territorial judges never see and federal marshals never ride. Before Amanda could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Lucas made an announcement that changed the entire trajectory of their conversation. Papa, Amanda should stay here while she figures out what to do next. We've got the extra room since Uncle Joseph moved to the Hopi Mesas, and she doesn't have anywhere else safe to go. Amanda started to protest, but Daniel held up a hand. With the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected other people's lives, Lucas is right. Running without purpose is just another way of being lost. You need time to think, to plan, to figure out who your real enemies are and what resources you have to fight them. Can't do that from the back of a freight wagon heading toward uncertain sanctuary. I can't pay you, Amanda said, embarrassed by the admission, but needing to be honest about her financial situation. The $47 in her purse wouldn't last long at territorial hotel rates, and she had no idea when or if she'd be able to access her family's banking connections. The federal marshals have probably frozen any accounts connected to my father's business. I've got traveling money and whatever's left of my jewelry that hasn't been seized as evidence. Money isn't the only form of payment, Daniel replied, with the practical wisdom of someone who'd built a successful business in a cash-poor frontier economy. Lucas mentioned you worked in your father's bank. That means you understand contracts, financial structures, legal documents. Those are skills we could use around here for purposes you might find interesting. For what kind of purposes? For fighting back against the people who've been stealing from us for decades. Your former associates at the railroad aren't the first to find creative ways to separate tribes from their natural resources. We've been dealing with territorial land speculators, mining companies, and federal bureaucrats who think Indian treaty rights are just suggestions to be ignored since before you were born, as if summoned by their conversation, the trading Post door opened with a distinctive creak that announced the arrival of someone Daniel clearly recognized. The woman who entered immediately commanded attention despite her practical frontier clothing, moving with the purposeful stride of natural leadership and carrying herself with an authority that transcended formal titles. She was perhaps 45 years old, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun and clothing that suggested she'd spent the morning doing physical work that required both strength and skill. But her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to solving complex problems under pressure, and she surveyed the trading post's interior with the automatic assessment of a military scout evaluating tactical situations. "Daniel," she called in greeting, then stopped short when she saw Amanda sitting at the table with the telegraph message still visible between them. "I see we have a visitor. I hope I'm not interrupting important business discussions." "Sarah, meet Amanda Brooks," Daniel said, rising from his chair with the courtesy of someone who respected the newcomer's authority and valued her opinion on matters of tribal security. "Amanda, this is Sarah Crowfeather, our tribal council representative and the person who's been fighting railroad land theft for the past 5 years. Sarah Crowfeather studied Amanda with the same thorough assessment Daniel had given her, but with an additional layer of professional skepticism that suggested she'd learned not to trust strangers too quickly, especially strangers whose names appeared on federal telegraph messages. Her gaze moved from Amanda to the yellow paper on the table, and her expression shifted from polite curiosity to sharp recognition. "You're the railroad woman from Boston," Sarah said, not an accusation but a statement that invited confirmation or denial while simultaneously conveying that she already knew the answer. "The one whose signature appears on the Hopi land grant documents that transferred mineral rights to Union Pacific shell companies." "I am," Amanda replied, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the instinct to look away from someone whose people she'd inadvertently helped victimize. "And I understand if you want me to leave immediately. I wouldn't blame you for assuming I'm here as some kind of railroad spy." "Why would I assume that?" Sarah asked, settling into the fourth chair at their table without invitation, her manner suggesting someone accustomed to inserting herself into important conversations, whether she was formally invited or not. "You're the first person with inside knowledge of Union Pacific operations we've ever had access to. The question is whether you're willing to use that knowledge to help us, or whether you're just another Eastern criminal trying to hide in Indian territory." The directness of the challenge caught Amanda off guard in ways that federal marshals and newspaper reporters hadn't managed. She'd expected hostility, suspicion, rejection from people whose trust her signature had helped betray. She hadn't expected to be treated as a potential ally by the very people she'd inadvertently helped victimize. "I don't know what I can do to help," Amanda said honestly, her legal training automatically cataloging the potential dangers of sharing confidential information with people who had every reason to use it against her former associates. "Everything I know about Union Pacific operations is probably protected by business confidentiality agreements or family loyalty obligations. Even if I wanted to share information, doing so could expose me to additional criminal charges." Sarah leaned forward across the table, her expression intense with the focus of someone who'd been waiting years for exactly this opportunity. "Let me tell you what we know about Union Pacific operations in this region. 3 years ago, they started buying up water rights from individual landowners, paying gold coin for properties that most people thought were worthless desert. 6 months later, those same properties were transferred to a subsidiary called Desert Mountain Mining, which immediately applied for territorial permits to extract silver from lands adjacent to Hopi and Navajo reservations. Amanda felt something cold settle in her stomach as she recognized the pattern Sarah was describing. The same financial structures and corporate strategies that had appeared in dozens of documents she'd helped process through her father's bank. That's exactly the same structure they used for the tribal land grants. Shell companies, subsidiary transfers, Applications for resources that weren't disclosed in the original negotiations. Exactly. And the environmental surveys for the silver extraction were conducted by another Union Pacific subsidiary, which somehow concluded that large-scale mining operations would have no negative effects on water sources or grazing lands used by surrounding Indian communities. Sarah continued, producing a leather portfolio filled with documents that looked like they'd been obtained through methods she preferred not to discuss in detail. Lucas looked up from where he'd been quietly sketching in his notebook. His artistic attention focused on drawing detailed maps of the railroad operations Sarah was describing. Uncle Robert works for the surveying company. He says their equipment is old and their standards are designed to approve whatever the railroad wants approved, regardless of actual conditions. Robert Yazzie is Sarah's brother, Daniel explained to Amanda, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone discussing family connections that had become crucial sources of intelligence about corporate activities threatening tribal survival. Mining engineering degree from the Colorado School of Mines, works as a field supervisor for the company that conducted Union Pacific's environmental surveys. He's been documenting discrepancies between actual survey results and official reports for 2 years. Discrepancies that could prove deliberate fraud in territorial court. Sarah added, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been building a case piece by piece over years of patient investigation. But we need someone who understands corporate document structures to help us trace the connections between all these subsidiary companies. Someone who knows how shell corporations hide their real ownership and purposes from territorial authorities. Amanda stared at the 3 faces around the table, realizing that her presence here wasn't the accident she'd assumed it was. She'd fled from her problems in Boston, only to land in the middle of the same conspiracy on a different front. The people who'd used her to steal mineral rights from distant tribes were now preparing to destroy the land and water of the community that had offered her sanctuary. The silver mining operation, she asked slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in her mind as her financial training allowed her to see patterns that others might miss. When is it scheduled to begin actual extraction? 6 weeks, Sarah replied grimly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been fighting a deadline that seemed impossible to meet through conventional legal channels. Territorial permits were approved last month. Environmental clearances are being fast-tracked through the territorial government, and mining equipment starts arriving by freight wagon next week. Once they begin blasting operations, the damage to local water sources will be irreversible, and the tribal council's legal challenges to the permits have been tied up in territorial court for 8 months by lawyers who specialize in delaying tactics that serve railroad interests. Sarah replied with the bitter experience of someone who'd learned that legal systems could be manipulated by people with unlimited resources and political connections. By the time we get a hearing before a judge who isn't on Union Pacific's payroll, the mining operation will be an accomplished fact that can't be undone. Daniel leaned forward, his voice taking on the urgency of someone who'd watched this pattern repeat too many times to accept another defeat. This is why you can't just keep running, Amanda. The people who destroyed your life in Boston are about to destroy our homeland out here. You're the only person we've met who has the inside knowledge to help us prove what they're really planning to do to our people. Amanda looked out the window at the red rocks and endless sky, at the landscape that had seemed so alien just hours ago but now felt like something worth protecting. She thought about her brother William, who died at Gettysburg fighting for principles he believed in, who'd always told her that some things mattered more than personal safety or social standing. What exactly are you asking me to do? Amanda asked, though she thought she already knew the answer would require her to risk everything she had left to lose. Help us expose the connection between all these subsidiary companies. Sarah replied without hesitation, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. Use your knowledge of Union Pacific's corporate structure to trace the money flows and ownership patterns that tie everything together. Give us the evidence we need to prove that the environmental surveys were fraudulent and the mineral rights. Contracts were obtained through systematic deception. In exchange for what? A chance to fight back instead of just running away. Daniel said simply, his words carrying the weight of someone offering not just sanctuary but purpose. A place to stay while you figure out who you really want to be when this is all over. And maybe, if we're successful, evidence that could clear your name by proving you were a victim of the same conspiracy we're fighting against. Lucas looked up from his sketchpad with the serious expression that made him seem far older than 12, his artistic skills having produced a detailed map of railroad operations that connected corporate activities across 3 territories. Plus, we make really good fry bread, and Papa's teaching me silversmithing techniques that have been in our family for 6 generations. You could learn too, if you wanted to stay long enough. Despite everything, the federal charges, the family disgrace, the complete destruction of her former life, Amanda found herself smiling for the first time in weeks. Here in this remote trading post, surrounded by people who should have every reason to hate her, she'd found something she'd never had in her father's Boston banking house, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal advancement or social approval. All right, Amanda heard herself saying, the words carrying the weight of a decision that would change everything she thought she knew about justice, loyalty, and the meaning of home. I'll help you fight them. But I want to do more than just trace corporate connections and document financial fraud. I want to take down the entire operation and make sure they can never do this to anyone else, anywhere else. Sarah Crowfeather smiled for the first time since entering the trading post, and Amanda saw the steel beneath her soft-spoken exterior. The determination of someone who'd been waiting years for the right opportunity to strike back against forces that seemed too powerful to defeat. Now you're talking like someone who belongs in Indian territory. 3 days later, Amanda found herself in the root cellar beneath Daniel's trading post, surrounded by evidence that would have made territorial prosecutors rich if they'd known it existed. The underground chamber had been converted into what could only be described as a resistance headquarters, with hand-drawn maps covering every stone wall, wooden crates stuffed with corporate documents and territorial land records and oil lamps, providing enough light to work by while maintaining concealment from any unwelcome visitors who might arrive asking inconvenient questions. Robert Yazzie turned out to be nothing like Amanda had expected when Sarah first mentioned her brother. At 32, he possessed the lean build and calloused hands of someone who spent his days surveying hostile terrain in harsh desert conditions. But his dark eyes held the analytical intelligence of an engineer who understood that technical data could be weaponized when properly assembled and presented to the right authorities. His mining degree from Colorado hung on the cellar wall beside traditional Navajo artwork, a visual representation of someone who moved easily between 2 worlds while serving his people's interests in both. These are the official geological survey reports that Desert Mountain Mining submitted to the Territorial Land Office, Robert explained, spreading a series of hand-drawn charts across a rough wooden table that served as their central workspace. The documents were covered with technical notations and mineral assessments that painted a picture of modest silver deposits suitable for small-scale extraction without significant environmental impact. Clean water sources, minimal geological instability, no indication of existing contamination that would complicate mining operations. Textbook territorial development documentation that meets every legal requirement. And these, he continued, producing a second set of charts from a locked wooden chest that had clearly been liberated from official sources through methods he preferred not to discuss in detail, are the actual survey results from the same testing locations, conducted with properly calibrated equipment and analyzed according to current territorial mining standards, rather than outdated protocols. From the 1870s, Amanda studied both sets of geological data with the same focus she'd once applied to railroad investment portfolios, and the discrepancies were staggering enough to constitute criminal fraud by any reasonable legal standard. The official reports showed silver deposits that could be extracted through simple shaft mining techniques, without affecting local water sources or grazing lands. The actual survey results revealed a complex underground river system that would be catastrophically disrupted by any significant excavation, while the silver deposits themselves were mixed with mercury compounds that would poison everything downstream for decades. They're not just lying about the environmental impact of future mining operations. Amanda realized with growing horror as her financial training allowed her to see patterns that others might miss. They're covering up existing geological conditions that make the entire area unsuitable for any kind of mineral extraction, according to territorial mining law. This isn't just corporate fraud. This is deliberate environmental warfare disguised as legitimate business development. Gets worse, Robert replied grimly, leading her to a collection of glass bottles filled with water samples that had been collected from various locations around the proposed mining site over the past 6 months. The liquid in some bottles was crystal clear, while others showed disturbing discoloration that suggested contamination from unknown sources. The underground river system connects directly to 3 separate spring systems that provide drinking water for Hopi villages and Navajo grazing areas. If Desert Mountain starts blasting and processing silver ore without proper containment, they'll poison the water supply for over 2,000 people. Sarah Crow Feather emerged from behind a stack of territorial land records where she'd been cross-referencing corporate ownership documents with federal treaty provisions, building a comprehensive picture of how railroad companies systematically violated agreements that were supposed to protect tribal interests. Amanda, you need to see this pattern we've discovered. I've been tracing the shell company ownership structures using the techniques you taught me to recognize, and the conspiracy goes much deeper than we originally suspected. The oil lamp light flickered across a wall-sized chart that looked like a spider web of corporate connections, with Desert Mountain Mining at the center and dozens of subsidiary companies radiating outward like spokes on a wagon wheel. But what made Amanda's blood run cold was the name at the top of the ownership chain, Union Pacific Railroad Company, the same corporation that employed her father's bank as their primary financial agent in New England. This is identical to the structure they used for the tribal mineral rights fraud back east, Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to her trained financial eye. Shell companies within. Shell companies, all designed to obscure the ultimate ownership and liability from territorial authorities. If something goes wrong with the silver extraction, no one will be able to trace responsibility back to Union Pacific because Desert Mountain Mining doesn't exist as anything more than a paper corporation registered in some territorial clerk's office. Which explains why they were willing to submit fraudulent geological surveys to the territorial government. Robert added, his engineering expertise allowing him to see the technical aspects of the criminal scheme. They're not planning to clean up any environmental damage because, legally speaking, Desert Mountain Mining will declare bankruptcy and disappear when the water poisoning starts affecting local communities. Union Pacific will walk away clean while 2,000 Navajo and Hopi people suffer the consequences. Lucas looked up from where he'd been quietly organizing documents with the methodical precision he applied to everything, his young hands sorting through papers that represented potential evidence in what could become the largest fraud prosecution in territorial history. So they're going to poison our water, lie about it to the territorial government, then disappear when people start getting sick and dying. That's exactly what they're planning, Amanda confirmed, feeling sick herself as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to someone with inside knowledge of how railroad corporations operated when they thought no one was watching. And they're going to do it in 6 weeks unless we can find a way to stop them using evidence that will hold up in territorial court. Daniel Silversmith had been silent during most of this briefing, but now he moved to a wall map that showed the proposed mining operation in relation to traditional Navajo and Hopi settlements, water sources, and grazing areas that had supported indigenous communities for generations. Red pins marked the locations of springs, trading posts, and family camps that would be affected by mercury contamination spreading through the underground river system. 2,000 people, he said quietly, each word carrying the weight of someone who knew most of those people personally and understood exactly what mercury poisoning would do to children, elders, and pregnant women over the course of years and decades, including 300 children under the age of 10. Mercury contamination doesn't kill quickly or cleanly. It destroys minds and bodies slowly, creating birth defects and developmental problems that devastate families for generations. Amanda stared at the map, at the red pins representing lives that would be destroyed by the same corporate machinery that had already ruined hers. But unlike her situation in Boston, this wasn't about money or social standing or family reputation. This was about survival, about the fundamental right to clean water and healthy children that transcended any legal technicalities or business considerations. "We have the evidence to prove geological fraud," she said, her voice gaining strength, as her resolve hardened into something that surprised her with its intensity. Robert's real survey results, the fraudulent environmental assessments, the corporate ownership trail connecting everything back to Union Pacific. What we need is a way to get this information to territorial authorities who aren't already bought and paid for by railroad money. "Already tried that approach," Sarah replied with the bitter experience of someone who'd spent years learning that official channels were often controlled by the same interests they were supposed to regulate. "Sent our documentation to the territorial land office, the mining commission, the territorial governor, and a federal judge in Santa Fe. The land office says they can't challenge approved permits without new evidence that meets federal standards. The mining commission claims they have no authority over private corporate decisions. The governor sent a form letter thanking us for our civic concern. And the federal judge scheduled a hearing for 6 months from now, so the official channels are blocked by people who profit from keeping them blocked." Amanda summarized, recognizing the pattern of institutional corruption that she'd seen corporations used to prevent unfavorable regulations or unwanted scrutiny in dozens of similar situations. "Which means we need to find ways to present our evidence that bypass the normal territorial legal system entirely." Robert grinned, the expression transforming his serious face into something that reminded Amanda why Sarah had been so confident in bringing her into their resistance network. "Now you're thinking like someone who grew up fighting railroad companies and territorial governments that think Indian treaty rights are just suggestions to be ignored when inconvenient. When the official system won't help you, you build your own system using whatever tools and allies you can find." Before Amanda could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Sarah activated what appeared to be a sophisticated communication setup hidden behind barrels of trading post supplies. Multiple mirrors angled to catch and reflect sunlight, a system that Amanda realized could send coded signals across vast distances without relying on territorial telegraph lines that could be monitored by corporate or government interests. "Meet the Tribal Intelligence Network," Sarah announced with obvious pride, adjusting mirrors to begin transmitting a complex pattern of light flashes toward the mesa tops visible through small windows cut into the cellar's stone walls. 43 tribes across Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah territories, connected by signal fires, mirror codes, and traditional messenger routes that predate territorial governments by centuries. When official communication fails, tribal sovereignty provides its own solutions that no railroad company or territorial authority can control or monitor. The mirror system began receiving return signals almost immediately, bright flashes from distant mesas that carried information Amanda couldn't decode but that Sarah obviously understood perfectly. Within minutes, she was plotting information on their wall maps, that revealed the true scope of Union Pacific's operations across the territorial Southwest. They're not waiting for the 6-week timeline we were told about, Amanda realized, with growing alarm as Sarah translated the incoming intelligence reports. These mirror signals indicate that mining equipment has been arriving at remote locations for weeks, hidden from territorial inspectors and local observation. The silver extraction operation is much further advanced than anyone has been told, which means we have less time than we thought to prevent environmental disaster, Daniel confirmed, his voice carrying the grim satisfaction of someone whose worst suspicions were being confirmed by hard evidence. But it also means they're violating territorial mining laws by beginning work before final permit approval and environmental clearance. That's not just civil fraud anymore. That's criminal violation of territorial sovereignty that could trigger federal intervention if we can prove it to the right authorities. Amanda studied the intelligence reports with the analytical mind that had made her valuable in her father's banking house. But now she was using those skills to protect rather than exploit indigenous communities, who'd offered her sanctuary when her own people had abandoned her. The equipment being moved in secret suggests they know the operation violates territorial law, and they're trying to present officials with an accomplished fact that can't be reversed. If we can document these illegal activities with photographic evidence and witness testimony, we can trigger territorial law enforcement actions that even Union Pacific can't suppress through bribery or political influence. Better than that, Robert interjected, producing a leather portfolio filled with photographs that made Amanda's heart race with their potential as criminal evidence. I've been documenting safety violations and illegal construction at the hidden mining sites for 3 weeks, using a camera borrowed from the territorial surveyor's office. Workers without proper safety equipment, hazardous chemicals being stored without containment, water sources being deliberately diverted to hide contamination from territorial inspectors. This is photographic evidence of criminal activity that violates every territorial mining regulation, Amanda said, examining images that would make any honest prosecutor's career, while simultaneously destroying corporate executives who thought they were above territorial law. Environmental crimes, worker endangerment, evidence tampering, violation of tribal treaty rights. Why haven't you presented this evidence to territorial law enforcement authorities? Because territorial law enforcement has been compromised by railroad money and political pressure, Sarah explained with the weary tone of someone who'd learned not to trust official institutions that were supposed to protect public interests. The Territorial Marshal's Office has 2 deputies on Union Pacific's payroll through shell company contracts. The territorial courts have been packed with judges who owe their appointments to railroad political influence. And federal authorities move too slowly to stop immediate environmental threats that will be irreversible once they begin. So what's our strategy for getting this evidence to people who can act on it? Amanda asked, though she was beginning to understand that she'd stumbled into something far more sophisticated and dangerous than she'd initially realized. Lucas looked up from his sketchpad, where he'd been drawing detailed diagrams of the mining equipment positions based on Robert's photographic evidence and Sarah's intelligence reports. We're going to expose them ourselves, using methods they won't expect and can't defend against. How does a 12-year-old boy expose a multi-million-dollar railroad conspiracy that has territorial officials bought and paid for? Same way our ancestors stopped the cavalry and territorial governments that thought superior firepower meant automatic victory. Daniel replied with a smile that carried ancient wisdom mixed with modern determination. You don't fight corporate giants using their own weapons and legal systems. You use weapons they don't understand and can't counter, because they're based on principles that don't appear in any territorial law books. Sarah activated another part of their hidden communication system, revealing that the mirrors were only one component of a network that included traditional smoke signals, mounted messengers, and what appeared to be a printing press concealed behind trading post merchandise. This weekend is the annual Intertribal Gathering in Santa Fe, where territorial officials meet with tribal leaders to discuss treaty compliance and resource management issues. 300 tribal representatives, territorial politicians, and newspaper reporters from across the Southwest. If we can present our evidence at that gathering, with proper documentation and witness testimony, we can create territorial attention that Union Pacific can't ignore or suppress through their usual methods. But the gathering is in Santa Fe, Amanda pointed out, her practical mind immediately focusing on the logistical challenges of transporting sensitive evidence across hostile territory, where railroad agents and territorial authorities might be watching for exactly such an attempt. How do we get there with evidence that's probably too sensitive to trust to normal transportation, especially when federal marshals are looking for me personally? Robert grinned again, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment to reveal capabilities that outsiders never suspected existed. Leave that to the Tribal Underground Railroad. We've been moving sensitive materials, threatened activists, and important witnesses across territorial lines for decades without detection by territorial or federal authorities. The United States government isn't the only organization that knows how to run covert operations when the situation requires it. Before Amanda could process the full implications of that statement, the cellar entrance opened with a distinctive creak that made everyone in the room reach for weapons with practiced speed. But the figure who descended the wooden stairs was someone Daniel clearly recognized and trusted. An elderly Navajo man whose presence immediately commanded respect from everyone present. The newcomer was perhaps 65 years old, with silver hair braided down his back and traditional clothing that managed to seem both ancient and practical for frontier conditions. But it was his presence that filled the underground chamber with an authority that seemed to flow from deep roots, and generations of leadership experience that transcended any formal titles or territorial recognition. Grandfather Henry, Lucas said, using a term that seemed to indicate respect rather than direct family relationship, his voice carrying the formal courtesy he reserved for addressing tribal elders. Amanda, this is Henry Begay, former war chief, and the person who organized the tribal intelligence network that connects resistance movements across 4 territories. Henry Begay studied Amanda with eyes that seemed to see through surface appearances to underlying character. The same thorough assessment she'd experienced from Daniel and Sarah, but magnified by decades of leadership experience and survival skills that had been tested against cavalry charges, territorial governments, and railroad corporations that thought superior resources guaranteed victory. So you are the railroad banker's daughter who has decided to fight the same people who used her family's financial connections to steal from my people. Henry observed, not a question but a statement that invited confirmation, while simultaneously evaluating her worthiness as an ally in battles where mistakes meant death. Sarah tells me you understand corporate structures and territorial legal systems. What she did not tell me is whether you understand the price of real resistance against forces that have unlimited resources and no moral boundaries. Amanda met the elder's gaze directly, recognizing that this was a test that would determine whether she was accepted as a genuine ally or remained an outsider seeking redemption through convenient gestures that cost her nothing important. I understand that I've lived my entire adult life serving systems that destroy communities like this one for profit and political advantage. I understand that running away from that responsibility doesn't change anything or help anyone. And I understand that some fights are worth the risk of losing everything, even if you're not certain of victory. Henry nodded slowly, approval flickering in his dark eyes like sunlight reflecting off deep water. Good. Because what we are planning will expose all of us to territorial criminal charges, corporate retaliation, and personal danger that could continue for years or decades. Railroad companies have unlimited financial resources and political connections that reach into every level of territorial and federal government. They will try to destroy everyone who threatens their profits, using every weapon at their disposal. What exactly are we planning? Amanda asked. Though she suspected the answer would be more dangerous and far-reaching than anything she'd experienced during her comfortable life in Boston society. Direct action, Henry replied simply, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd fought cavalry charges and survived territorial government attempts at cultural genocide. If the legal system won't protect our water, our land, and our children from corporate criminals, then we will protect them ourselves using whatever methods prove necessary and effective. Robert spread a detailed map of the mining sites across their central table, marking security positions, equipment locations, and what appeared to be infiltration routes that had been scouted by people with military-level expertise in reconnaissance and tactical planning. Tomorrow night, we document everything. Every safety violation, every environmental crime, every piece of evidence that proves criminal fraud and deliberate treaty violations. We get it all on photographic plates, with precise location records and witness statements that will hold up in any honest territorial court. And then, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been planning this operation for months, we present everything simultaneously to tribal councils, territorial newspapers, and federal authorities who aren't completely corrupted by railroad money. Create a territory-wide scandal that forces immediate investigation and shuts down the mining operation before it can poison our water supplies. The communication equipment you've seen down here, Daniel explained, gesturing toward the mirror. Systems, and what Amanda was beginning to realize was a sophisticated intelligence network, can reach every major settlement in 4 territories within hours of activation. When we expose Union Pacific's crimes, every newspaper, every territorial official, and every federal authority in the Southwest will receive our evidence simultaneously, making it impossible for them to suppress or ignore. Amanda stared at the faces around her, realizing she'd stumbled into a resistance movement that operated with the sophistication of a military intelligence operation and the moral authority of people fighting for their communities, survival against forces that viewed them as obstacles to be eliminated rather than human beings with legal rights and legitimate interests. This is going to work, she said, surprise evident in her voice as her financial expertise allowed her to see the strategic brilliance of their approach. You actually have the resources and organization to expose them before they can complete their environmental crimes. We have something better than resources, Henry replied with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived decades of battles against seemingly superior forces. We have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Union Pacific Railroad and Desert Mountain Mining have already decided our communities are expendable obstacles to their profit margins. Now they're going to discover what expendable people can accomplish when they stop worrying about consequences that don't matter compared to protecting their children's future. Lucas looked up from his detailed sketches of mining equipment and security positions, his young face serious with understanding that went far beyond his 12 years of life experience. Amanda, are you ready to stop running from your past and start fighting for our future? Amanda thought about her former life in Boston, about the banker's daughter who'd trusted the wrong people and signed documents that destroyed indigenous communities she'd never met. She thought about federal marshals who wanted to send her to territorial prison for crimes she hadn't knowingly committed. And she thought about 2,000 people, including 300 children, whose water supply was about to be poisoned by the same criminals who'd already ruined her life for their own profit. Yes, she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd finally found a cause worth the risk of everything she had left to lose. I'm ready to fight. At midnight, under a moonless sky that turned the desert into an ocean of black velvet studded with stars, Amanda crouched behind a sandstone boulder the size of a freight wagon, wearing dark clothing that smelled like sage smoke and carrying equipment she'd never imagined using during her privileged life in Boston society. A leather satchel containing glass photographic plates hung across her shoulder, while her pockets bulged with a portable camera, magnifying glass, and what Robert had described as evidence collection materials borrowed from his mining surveyors. Toolkit: the illegal desert mountain mining operation sprawled across the valley floor below them like a mechanical infection eating away at the pristine desert landscape. Kerosene lanterns cast harsh yellow light across construction equipment worth thousands of dollars, while canvas tents housed workers and supervisors who had no idea their activities were being documented by people with every legal right to be. Outraged by what they were witnessing, "Count 8 guards on patrol," whispered Thomas Yazzie, Robert's younger cousin and a former cavalry scout whose military experience had been repurposed for environmental protection after he'd learned what the U.S. Army really thought about Indian treaty rights. He studied the mining camp through a brass telescope liberated from a territorial surveyor's office, mapping guard movements with the patience of someone who'd learned reconnaissance techniques during Apache campaigns. 2 at the main supply depot, 2 circling the equipment yard, 2 at the processing area, and 2 sleeping by the supervisor's tent. "They're not expecting trouble from anyone except maybe claim jumpers." "Armed?" asked Amanda, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the fear that made her hands tremble every time she thought about the consequences of being caught by people who had every reason to silence witnesses permanently. "Rifles and sidearms," Thomas confirmed, adjusting his scope to examine individual guards more closely. "Private security hired through territorial employment agencies, not railroad police or territorial law enforcement. But they've got authority to detain trespassers and probably shoot anyone they consider a threat to expensive mining equipment." Robert adjusted the leather pack containing his photographic equipment and chemical processing supplies, each piece of gear representing evidence that could expose environmental crimes worth prosecuting under territorial mining law. His engineering training had taught him to document industrial operations with scientific precision, but tonight those skills would serve tribal interests rather than corporate profits. The contaminated area extends from the main excavation site to the temporary mercury processing facility, Robert reported, consulting hand-drawn maps that showed the true extent of environmental damage already occurring despite official denials. "I need photographic documentation of at least 6 separate violations to prevent air deliberately poisoning water sources in violation of territorial environmental protection statutes." "Amanda handles the document photography," Sarah's voice whispered through the darkness from her position, coordinating their operation from a concealed observation post 200 yards away. "The supervisor's tent contains territorial permits, environmental assessments, and worker safety records that will prove criminal negligence and deliberate fraud. Get everything with precise location notations and timestamps that will hold up in territorial court proceedings." Henry Begay's voice reached them through traditional hand signals rather than spoken words, his decades of resistance experience having taught him that sound carried farther than people expected in desert air. His message was simple but urgent. Weather conditions were changing, and they had maybe 2 hours before dawn made concealment impossible. Amanda checked her equipment one final time, still amazed that she was preparing to commit what territorial prosecutors would classify as criminal trespassing in service of exposing much more serious crimes. 6 weeks ago, her biggest risk had been social embarrassment at a Boston Tea Party if she made inappropriate conversation. Now she was about to infiltrate an illegal mining operation that could send her to territorial prison for additional years, beyond the federal charges she was already fleeing. But as she looked down at the operation that would poison 2,000 people for Union Pacific's profit margins, Amanda realized she'd never felt more certain about any decision in her privileged Eastern life. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of personal consequences or social disapproval. "Equipment ready," Thomas whispered, completing his final reconnaissance sweep. "Guards are following predictable patrol patterns, probably expecting nothing more dangerous than curious prospectors or lost travelers." Move out and stay low. The fence surrounding Desert Mountain's illegal operation was nothing more than ropes stretched between wooden posts, designed to mark territorial boundaries, rather than prevent determined infiltrators. But the real security lay in the operation's remote location and the assumption that no one with authority to challenge their activities would ever venture into this trackless desert region. They moved across exposed ground with fluid coordination, learned through 3 nights of practice, Amanda following Robert's lead while staying low and moving during gaps between the kerosene lanterns that provided illumination for night work. The desert floor was harder than she'd expected. Packed earth mixed with sharp stones that cut through her leather boots and reminded her constantly that she was far from the civilized world where such problems could be solved with money and social connections. The first target was a canvas-walled office tent that intelligence indicated contained the fraudulent environmental assessments and territorial permits that had enabled Desert Mountain to begin operations despite obvious violations of mining law. Amanda's heart hammered against her ribs as she knelt beside the tent's entrance, using lock-picking skills that Thomas had taught her during their brief training sessions. Inside, the tent was a treasure trove of criminal evidence that exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Wooden crates filled with territorial documents that directly contradicted Robert's real geological surveys from the same testing locations. A field desk covered with correspondence between Desert Mountain supervisors and Union Pacific executives discussing strategies for hiding environmental damage from territorial inspectors. Maps showing contaminated water sources that extended far beyond what had been disclosed to tribal councils or territorial authorities. Amanda's camera flashed repeatedly as she documented every piece of evidence, her banking experience allowing her to quickly identify the most damaging materials, while her new understanding of territorial mining law helped her recognize violations that honest prosecutors could use to send corporate executives to territorial prison. Internal memoranda discussing acceptable casualty rates for mercury poisoning among Indian populations. Budget documents showing money allocated for territorial relations that was actually being used to bribe mining inspectors. Contract modifications that transferred all environmental liability to shell companies with no assets to seize if legal judgments were ever obtained. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, finding a folder marked Contingency Operations that outlined Desert Mountain's strategy for dealing with environmental disasters that their own documents showed were inevitable rather than accidental. The plan wasn't prevention but damage control, calculating the cost of territorial legal settlements versus cleanup expenses and recommending corporate bankruptcy as the most cost-effective response to adverse outcomes affecting local populations. Her camera captured page after page of evidence that proved systematic environmental warfare disguised as legitimate territorial development. But the most damaging discovery was a detailed map showing 12 similar operations planned across Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah territories, all targeting areas adjacent to tribal lands and all using identical environmental fraud techniques. Robert's urgent whisper reached her through the tent walls from his position at the mercury processing facility. "Amanda, you need to see what they're doing with the contaminated materials. This isn't just environmental negligence. This is deliberate poisoning designed to make tribal lands uninhabitable." Amanda found Robert at what Desert Mountain had euphemistically labeled their temporary materials processing area, which turned out to be nothing more than open pits lined with canvas where mercury-contaminated silver ore was being dissolved using chemical processes that sent toxic runoff directly into the underground river system that supplied drinking water to dozens of tribal communities. Mercury concentrations here are 50 times higher than territorial safety limits for industrial operations and 200 times higher than safe drinking water standards, Robert reported, his voice tight with controlled rage as he collected Water samples in glass bottles that would provide scientific evidence of deliberate environmental crimes. They're not just accidentally contaminating the water supply. They're using the underground river system as an intentional disposal method for toxic waste they're legally required to contain and treat. Under the harsh kerosene light, Amanda could see that the processing pits were deliberately positioned to ensure maximum contamination of water sources that flowed directly toward tribal settlements. Worse, the excavation had exposed underground streams that were carrying mercury compounds into the regional aquifer system faster than anyone had calculated. They knew this would happen, Amanda realized, photographing the disaster with growing horror while her legal training allowed her to recognize evidence of premeditated environmental crimes. The geological surveys in their files show this underground water flow in precise detail. They deliberately chose this location because contaminating tribal water supplies was part of their business plan, not an unintended consequence of legitimate mining operations. Gets worse, Robert said grimly, leading her to a series of monitoring wells that had been drilled around the contamination zone according to territorial environmental regulations. The wells were supposed to provide early warning if toxic materials spread beyond the mining area, but someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure they would never function as intended. The monitoring equipment had been deliberately sabotaged, with water sampling mechanisms disconnected and test wells filled with clean sand to prevent accurate readings. Maintenance logs showed that the sabotage had been ordered by site supervisors and approved by Union Pacific executives who understood exactly what they were authorizing. This proves criminal intent beyond any reasonable doubt, Amanda said, her legal training allowing her to see evidence that would convince any honest territorial judge. They're not just accepting environmental damage as a cost of doing business. They're deliberately causing maximum contamination to force tribal communities off traditional lands that Union Pacific wants for railroad expansion. This is genocide disguised as territorial development. Thomas's urgent hand signal from his overwatch position cut through their evidence collection with a warning that made both of them freeze in place. Armed guards were investigating unusual activity near the processing area, moving with the purposeful stride of men who'd been alerted to potential security problems. 2 guards, rifles ready, heading directly toward your position, Thomas whispered through the traditional communication methods that couldn't be overheard by anyone not trained in tribal tactical coordination. You've got maybe 60 seconds before they reach the contamination site. Move northwest toward the equipment depot, and I'll create a distraction to draw them away from your escape route. Amanda and Robert moved with desperate efficiency, collecting final water samples and photographing the last pieces of evidence, while Thomas prepared to risk his own safety to ensure their mission succeeded. The sound of approaching boots crunched across gravel as private security guards investigated what they probably assumed was wildlife disturbing their illegal operations. Lights out, move toward the supply wagons, Thomas signaled through hand gestures that Amanda was still learning to interpret. I'll trigger their attention at the eastern perimeter to buy you time to reach the extraction point with the evidence intact. They crawled through shadows cast by mining equipment worth more than most territorial towns, Amanda's expensive camera gear scraping against desert stone as they navigated between steam-powered excavators and ore processing machinery. Her Boston social training had never included instruction in military-style infiltration techniques, but desperation proved an excellent teacher for skills she'd never imagined needing. The distraction Thomas created involved throwing rocks at the horses picketed near the supervisor's tent, causing enough commotion to send security guards racing toward what they assumed was an attempt to steal valuable animals. The tactic bought them precious minutes to reach their predetermined escape route, but Amanda could hear shouted orders indicating that additional security personnel were being roused from sleep. Territorial law enforcement responding to security. Alert! Sarah's whispered warning reached them through the traditional communication network that connected their Operation to tribal intelligence sources throughout the region. Territorial Marshal's Office dispatched 2 deputies from Flagstaff. Estimated arrival 1 hour. They're treating this as potential claim jumping that could escalate to armed robbery. They reached the perimeter rope fence as the first territorial authority signals became visible in the distance. Thomas's precise planning having prepared multiple escape routes for exactly this contingency. But as Amanda squeezed through the gap they'd created in the boundary markers, her camera bag caught on a fence post and spilled glass photographic plates across the desert floor in a cascade of irreplaceable evidence. Exposed photographic plates containing images of environmental crimes, water contamination samples that proved deliberate poisoning, and document copies that could expose Union Pacific's systematic fraud scattered in the darkness as approaching riders swept closer to their position. Robert grabbed what he could while Thomas provided cover, but Amanda realized they were leaving behind evidence that could expose their entire operation to corporate retaliation. "Leave it," Thomas commanded, his military training prioritizing mission survival over complete evidence collection. "We've got enough documentation to expose their crimes and trigger territorial investigation. Move now or lose everything, including our lives." They ran across open desert terrain, navigation guided by star positions and Thomas's knowledge of traditional travel routes that didn't appear on any territorial maps. While behind them, the mining site erupted with activity that suggested a coordinated response far beyond normal security protocols. Kerosene lanterns swept the landscape with military precision. Horses thundered to life carrying armed riders, and shouted communications indicated a systematic search effort that extended well beyond the immediate mining area. "They're treating this like a territorial emergency," Thomas observed as they reached their hidden horses, concealed in a canyon that had provided sanctuary for tribal resistance fighters since the Apache Wars. Territorial response, multiple deputy coordination, and what sounds like authorization to use lethal force against anyone found trespassing on corporate property. Amanda climbed onto her borrowed horse, her hands shaking from exhaustion and the realization of what they'd accomplished despite the dangers they'd faced. The evidence they'd collected would expose crimes that reached from corporate boardrooms to territorial government offices, threatening powerful people who had unlimited resources and no moral constraints about protecting their interests. "Because we didn't just discover environmental crimes," she said, as understanding crystallized with terrifying clarity. "We discovered evidence of systematic territorial fraud that could trigger federal investigation of Union Pacific's land grant operations across the entire Southwest. We've stumbled into something that threatens the largest corporate conspiracy in territorial history." As they rode towards safety through desert trails that had hidden Apache warriors and territorial refugees for decades, Amanda understood that her transformation from Boston society lady to tribal resistance fighter was now complete and irreversible. The evidence they'd risked their lives to collect could save 2,000 people from mercury poisoning while simultaneously exposing the corporate criminals who destroyed her former life. The question now was whether they could survive long enough to present their evidence to authorities who might actually enforce territorial law against people rich enough to buy judges and territorial officials. 3 months after Amanda Brooks disappeared into the Santa Fe courthouse while territorial marshals surrounded the building, the American West had changed in ways that railroad executives and territorial officials never imagined possible. Her testimony before the Emergency Territorial Commission on Corporate Fraud had triggered an avalanche of federal investigations that transformed environmental protection from tribal concern into national policy. The photograph she'd risked her life to collect became evidence in the largest territorial prosecution in Southwestern history, while her banking expertise helped federal prosecutors trace financial connections that reached from Union Pacific boardrooms to the War Department in Washington. More importantly, tribal communities across 4 territories began coordinating, resistance efforts that corporate and governmental power structures couldn't suppress through traditional divide-and-conquer tactics. Robert Yazzie stood before the territorial legislature in Santa Fe, presenting geological evidence that had survived armed pursuit to reach federal jurisdiction. His mercury contamination samples provided scientific proof of systematic environmental warfare that violated every territorial mining regulation, while his testimony connected Union Pacific's operations to similar crimes being committed by railroad companies from California to Texas. The evidence collected by Amanda Brooks and our Tribal Resistance Network proves that environmental destruction of Indian lands isn't accidental corporate negligence. Robert announced to an audience that included territorial representatives, federal investigators, and newspaper correspondents from major eastern cities. It's systematic warfare designed to eliminate Indian populations who oppose railroad expansion. Environmental crimes against Navajo and Hopi communities are part of a continental pattern that threatens every tribe from the Pacific Ocean to the Rio Grande. Union Pacific Railroad Company ceased meaningful operations in Arizona territory within 2 months of Amanda's testimony reaching federal authorities. Territorial courts that had protected the company's illegal activities found themselves under federal investigation, while corporate executives who had authorized environmental warfare faced extradition to face charges in territorial courts where juries included people whose water supplies had been poisoned. The illegal mining operation at Desert Mountain was shut down by federal court order after territorial authorities could no longer ignore evidence that had reached newspapers in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. More significantly, the contaminated sites became the focus of the largest environmental restoration effort in territorial history, funded by Union Pacific assets seized under federal racketeering statutes. Lucas Silversmith, now 13 years old and recognized throughout the Southwest as the youngest witness to testify in federal court, stood beside the mercury processing pits that had once threatened to poison 2,000 people. Federal cleanup crews worked around the clock to contain contamination that corporate documents had revealed was deliberate rather than accidental. Amanda Brooks taught us that some fights are worth everything you have, Lucas announced to territorial newspapers covering the cleanup effort. She was just traveling through our desert until she discovered people who needed help. Then she stopped running and started fighting. Now the whole territory is fighting with us. The Santa Fe courthouse that had sheltered Amanda during 3 months of testimony became the center of federal investigations that revealed the true scope of Union Pacific's environmental warfare against tribal communities. When federal marshals finally gained access to corporate documents that territorial officials had hidden for years, they discovered evidence of systematic poisoning operations that extended far beyond Arizona territory. Amanda emerged from 3 months of federal protection looking nothing like the Boston banker's daughter who had fled west in a broken wagon. Her hair was braided in traditional Navajo style. Her hands carried the silver stains of jewelry making she'd learned during her sanctuary, and her eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who had found her true purpose in life despite losing everything she'd once thought mattered. The federal investigation never stopped. She explained to territorial reporters documenting environmental crimes that had taken place under their noses. But I was never hiding from justice. I was coordinating with federal prosecutors to build cases against corporate executives who thought territorial isolation would protect them from federal law. While Union Pacific agents searched for me in territorial jails, I was working with federal investigators to expose systematic environmental warfare that violated every mining law and treaty obligation in the territorial legal code. The documents recovered from Union Pacific's secret territorial offices revealed the true scope of corporate environmental warfare against tribal communities. Detailed plans for poisoning water sources across 6 territories, evidence of federal complicity in systematic treaty violations. and coordination networks that connected environmental destruction from the Canadian border to Mexico. 6 months after her testimony exposes systematic environmental warfare, Amanda Brooks stood in the silver workshop behind Daniel's trading post, teaching territorial mining law to tribal college students, who would use their knowledge to protect traditional lands from future corporate attacks. Her transformation from Boston society lady to tribal rights advocate represented a personal journey that had inspired environmental activists throughout the territorial West. Daniel Silversmith presented her with a silver bracelet crafted using traditional techniques that Lucas had mastered during her testimony period. The turquoise settings came from stones mined on tribal land using environmental practices that restored rather than destroyed local water sources. "You stopped being someone who was just passing through," Daniel observed with a gentle wisdom that had first made Amanda feel welcome in a community that should have been hostile to someone with her corporate background. "Now you're someone who stays, someone who builds, someone who helps others find their way home to what matters most." The bracelet carried an inscription in Navajo that Sarah Crow Feather translated for territorial reporters, documenting Amanda's transformation from environmental criminal to tribal rights advocate. "She came as a stranger running from her past and stayed as family fighting for our future." Whispering Winds Trading Post had been transformed into a territorial center for environmental law education, where railroad executives, territorial officials, and environmental advocates from throughout the Southwest came to learn about tribal approaches to sustainable resource management that protected rather than exploited natural systems. Amanda's story of personal transformation and community acceptance became a model for reconciliation between extractive industries and indigenous communities throughout the territorial West. Robert Yazzie returned from Washington carrying a federal appointment as Special Territorial Inspector for Indian Environmental Rights, a position that allowed him to investigate corporate environmental crimes with federal authority that transcended territorial political boundaries. His engineering expertise, combined with traditional environmental knowledge learned from his community, represented a new approach to environmental protection that integrated modern science with ancestral wisdom. Thomas Yazzie established a training program that taught former cavalry soldiers how to apply their military skills to environmental protection rather than territorial conquest. Veterans who had once served corporate interests learned to use their expertise defending tribal communities against environmental warfare that violated every principle of honor they'd sworn to uphold. The most important battles aren't fought with cavalry charges or corporate lawyers, Thomas explained to veterans learning environmental protection tactics. They're fought with evidence, territorial law, and communities that refuse to accept destruction as the inevitable price of progress. Amanda Brooks proved that even people who start on the wrong side can become powerful allies when they understand what's really at stake for future generations. As sunset painted Monument Valley in shades of gold and crimson that had inspired Navajo artists for generations, Amanda stood on the trading post's porch watching Lucas sketch environmental restoration projects that would heal landscape damaged by decades of corporate resource extraction. The boy who had asked if she wanted to meet his papa had grown into a young man whose artistic vision encompassed not just individual survival, but entire communities working toward sustainable futures. She was no longer someone traveling through the West, running from a past she couldn't change or control. She had become someone who stayed, who built, who helped others transform their relationship with the land they called home. The silver stains on her hands matched those of the Silversmith family that had adopted her, marking her as someone who created beauty rather than destroying it for profit or social advancement. The territorial highway that had brought her here still carried travelers fleeing problems they couldn't solve in their former homes. But now the trading post served as a destination rather than just a waypoint, a place where people could learn that running toward purpose was more powerful than running away from mistakes. Amanda's journey from corporate criminal to environmental Advocate had become a roadmap others could follow toward their own redemption and transformation. She was home. Snow fell gently on Monument Valley for the first time in 7 years, transforming the red sandstone spires into cathedral towers, crowned with white lace that caught the winter sunlight and scattered it like diamonds across the desert floor. Inside the expanded trading post at Whispering Winds, 3 generations of the silversmith family gathered around a massive pine table laden with dishes that told the story of cultures learning to blend without losing their essential character. Amanda Brooks silversmith adjusted the traditional Navajo wedding necklace that proclaimed her marriage to Daniel while simultaneously straightening the Boston lace tablecloth that her former housekeeper had sent west as a wedding gift 2 years earlier. At 35, she moved with the confident grace of someone who had learned to navigate between worlds without losing her footing in either, her silver-stained hands equally comfortable with territorial legal documents and traditional jewelry-making techniques. Mama Amanda, tell the story about the night you and Uncle Robert stole all those pictures from the bad men, demanded 6-year-old Mary Silversmith, Daniel's niece who had adopted Amanda with the fierce loyalty that children reserve for adults, who take their questions seriously and never lie about important matters. We didn't steal anything, Amanda corrected gently, settling into her chair with the patient manner of someone who had told this story dozens of times, but understood its importance to children, who needed to know that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. We collected evidence of crimes that were being committed against our people's water and land. There's a difference between stealing and gathering proof that someone else is stealing. Lucas, now 18 and preparing to leave for law school in Denver, looked up from the silver work he was completing as a Christmas gift for his father. His artistic skills had evolved from childhood sketches into sophisticated technical drawings that documented environmental restoration projects throughout the territorial Southwest. The important part isn't what we called it, he observed with the wisdom of someone who had grown up watching legal battles decided by how stories were told. The important part is that we stopped them from poisoning everyone's water. Through the trading post windows, Amanda could see the permanent settlement that had grown up around Whispering Winds during the 5 years since Union Pacific's territorial operations collapsed under federal investigation. What had once been an isolated outpost now served as the unofficial capital of a new kind of territorial community, where former railroad workers learned sustainable mining techniques from tribal engineers and territorial officials came to study environmental protection methods that prevented rather than cleaned up corporate disasters. The Federal Environmental Protection Office occupied a stone building that Robert Yazzie had designed using traditional Navajo architectural principles, combined with modern territorial construction techniques. As the first federal territorial inspector for Indian environmental rights, Robert had transformed environmental law enforcement from reactive punishment to proactive prevention, establishing legal precedents that protected tribal communities. From California to Texas, 5 more territorial governors requested copies of our environmental protection protocols this year, Robert reported, entering the trading post with his arms full of official correspondence that represented the transformation of tribal resistance into federal policy. Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and Wyoming territories all want to implement our water protection standards before railroad companies can establish operations similar to what Union Pacific attempted here. Sarah Crowfeather followed him inside, shaking snow from the heavy coat that marked her new status as the first Indian woman elected to territorial office in Arizona's history. Her victory in the territorial assembly elections had shocked political observers who assumed that women and Indians were decades away from meaningful political participation. But her environmental expertise and proven ability to challenge corporate power had made her indispensable to territorial voters who valued competence over convention. Federal legislation passed the House of Representatives last week, Sarah announced, spreading newspaper clippings across the table that documented the national impact of their local resistance efforts. The Territorial Environmental Protection Act establishes federal oversight of all mining operations on or adjacent to Indian lands, requires independent environmental assessment by tribal engineers, and provides criminal penalties for corporate executives who authorize environmental fraud. The Senate is expected to vote next month. Amanda studied the faces around the table, marveling at how much had changed since that August day when a broken wagon wheel had stranded her in what she'd thought was the middle of nowhere. The desperate fugitive who had stumbled into Lucas's kindness had become someone whose testimony helped reshape territorial law, whose banking expertise served tribal interests, and whose personal transformation inspired other Eastern refugees. Seeking meaningful lives in the territorial West, Mrs. Patterson from the Women's Suffrage Association wrote again. Amanda reported, displaying a letter that had arrived on the previous week's stagecoach. She wants me to speak at their national convention in Chicago about how territorial women are already participating in government and environmental protection in ways that Eastern states haven't achieved. Apparently, my story of transformation from corporate criminal to territorial advocate has become inspiration for women who want to move west and find meaningful work. Daniel smiled, the expression that had first convinced Amanda that she might be welcome in a community that had every reason to reject someone with her background. You could tell them about the school, he suggested, gesturing toward the classroom addition where Amanda taught territorial environmental law to students from across the Southwest. 15 graduates working as tribal environmental advocates. From Oregon to Texas, that's more practical change than most Eastern women's organizations accomplish with decades of meetings and petitions. The school had become Amanda's greatest pride, a place where traditional ecological knowledge met territorial legal expertise to create environmental advocates who understood both scientific principles and political realities. Her students included former railroad workers learning sustainable development, tribal members mastering federal environmental law, and territorial officials discovering that environmental protection enhanced rather than hindered legitimate economic development as evening settled over Monument Valley, transforming the snow-covered landscape into something that belonged in a fairy tale rather than the harsh territorial reality Amanda had first encountered. The trading post filled with visitors who represented the community that had grown around their environmental advocacy work. Thomas Yazzie arrived with his wife and 3 children, carrying gifts carved from wood salvaged from abandoned Union Pacific mining equipment. His veteran environmental protection training program had graduated 47 former soldiers, who now served tribal communities throughout the territorial West, applying military discipline and tactical thinking to environmental defense rather than territorial conquest. Henry Begay entered with the quiet dignity that had made him the most respected tribal elder in 4 territories, carrying a traditional ceremonial pipe that would bless their Christmas celebration with smoke that connected earth to sky in prayers for continued wisdom and protection. At 70, he remained the strategic mind behind tribal resistance networks that had evolved from emergency response to permanent political organization. The children should hear the whole story, Henry announced with the authority of someone whose words carried the weight of ancestral wisdom and hard-won experience. Not just the exciting parts about midnight raids and territorial court victories, but the important parts about how strangers can become family and how people can change their lives by choosing to serve something larger than their own comfort. Amanda looked around the table at faces illuminated by kerosene lamplight and fire glow, at people who had accepted her despite every reason to distrust someone with her corporate background, at children who called her Mama Amanda and included her in their futures without reservation. The federal charges that had driven her west had been dropped 2 years earlier, when her cooperation with territorial prosecutors led to convictions that sent 17 Union Pacific executives to federal prison. But more importantly, she had discovered something in this remote trading post that she'd never found in Boston society. A sense of purpose that went beyond personal advancement. A community that valued contribution over connections. And work that mattered to people whose lives were improved by her efforts rather than exploitation disguised as legitimate business. As the Christmas celebration continued with traditional Navajo songs, mixed with territorial carols that reflected the cultural blending that had enriched everyone involved, Amanda stepped onto the trading post porch to watch snow continue falling on Monument Valley's ancient spires. The territorial highway that had brought her here still carried travelers seeking new lives, but now it also carried environmental advocates, federal investigators, and territorial officials who came to study methods that proved environmental protection and economic development could coexist. The silver trail that had begun with Lucas's turquoise-stained hands had grown into something larger than any of them had imagined possible. Environmental protection training centers in 6 territories, federal legislation that protected tribal communities nationwide, and a new generation of environmental advocates who understood that the most important battles were fought with evidence and determination rather than corporate resources and political connections. She was no longer Amanda Brooks, the Boston banker's daughter who had signed documents that stole from Indian communities. She was Amanda Brooks Silversmith, territorial environmental advocate, wife, adoptive mother, and teacher who had learned that home wasn't a place you were born, but a community you chose to serve regardless of personal cost. The snow continued falling, each flake unique but contributing to something larger than itself, covering the desert with beauty that would nourish the earth when spring returned. Like the environmental protection movement that had grown from their resistance efforts, individual contributions accumulated into transformation that seemed impossible until it became inevitable. Inside the trading post, laughter and music celebrated not just Christmas, but the miracle of strangers becoming family and individual transformation, inspiring community change. The silver trail continued, leading others toward the same discovery that Amanda had made 5 years earlier. Sometimes the most important journey is the one that teaches you to stop traveling and start belonging.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.